Hi everybody, Dan Bailey here with another fun Fujifilm camera tip for you. Today we're going to talk about how to do focus bracketing on the X series cameras. Before we get started though, I just wanted to quickly mention my Photography on the Brain video lesson series. This is a 20 lesson bundle where I explore photography and creativity from a more cerebral standpoint and challenge you to apply some interesting and conceptual ideas to your own image making. And the idea is to not only help you guys create more compelling images, but to shoot photos that more closely match your own individual ideas about the scenes that you photograph. And I'm offering you guys the course for a special deal of 50% off, and you can find information here at this link. So I hope you'll check it out. So pretty much all of the newest X series models have a feature called focus bracketing, and this feature has actually been in the cameras for a while. Even the XT2 and the XH1 have this feature as well. Now, a lot of people don't know about this setting, and even for those who do, it can be a little confusing on how to use it. So in this video, I'm going to give you a rundown on how the setting works and how you can use it in real-life situations to create some pretty compelling imagery. But first, I'll give you a little background on what this whole feature is about. There's a technique called focus stacking, and this is when you create an entire series of photos of the same subject shot from the same vantage point, but the difference is that each photo is shot from a slightly different focus distance. So in each photo in your series, what's in focus is slightly further or closer than the previous image. So to make it easy to understand, let's say your first photo was shot with a focus distance of 1 inch, your second 2 inches, your third 3 inches, 4 inches, and so on. And depending on what you're shooting and how much variation you want in your focus, you could have a focus stacking series of say 10 images, 50 images, even 100 images or more. And so once you have your series, you pull them all into a program like Lightroom or Photoshop. And then the software analyzes all the shots and combines them or stacks them into one image. And the result is a final photo that has a much wider depth of field than you'd normally be able to get with a single image due to the limitations of your lens. And the results can be quite dramatic, which is why people like to use this technique, and again, why the focus bracketing feature on the Fujis allows you to get some really interesting shots. Traditionally, focus stacking is often used in macro and close-up photography when you already are dealing with very shallow depth of field. And that's not to say you can't get some really cool effects when shooting more traditional landscapes at greater distances, because with a lot of scenes you're still dealing with the limitations of trying to get everything sharp from front to back. And so using focus stacking on a traditional landscape might be just the way to get that exceptionally sharp photo from front to back that you're looking for. And aside from the camera, the only thing that you really need to get started with this kind of photography is a tripod or some other way to brace the camera. Okay, now let's talk about how you can do this yourself. I'm going to lay this out in 3 steps, the first of which is how to set your camera up for focus bracketing. The first thing you need to do is put your camera into bracket mode. If you have an XT series camera like the XT4 or XT3 or XT30, you simply go to the drive dial and turn it to bracket. Then you need to go into the drive settings menu so you can access the focus bracketing settings themselves. And the drive settings menu is actually found inside the shooting settings menu, which is the 3rd menu down, the one with the little camera icon on it. And once you're there, the first thing you need to do is to actually select focus bracketing. You'll see that it's the bottom option, so scroll down and hit OK. A lot of people forget this step and they wonder why it isn't working. I've messed this up too. It's an easy one to miss. Another way to access the focus bracket settings in the T-series cameras, like the XT3 or XT4, is to press the dedicated function button that's set up to drive settings. Now by default, on a lot of the cameras, it's the front function button, which is down by the lens. Once you've selected bracket on the drive dial, you can press that function button and that'll bring up the bracket settings menu. If one of your function buttons is not already set to drive, you can set one by simply holding the display back button down until you bring up the function button menu. And this allows you to scroll through, pick one of the buttons, and then assign whatever function you want. So you can look for the settings that's called drive settings. Now if you're using a camera that has a dedicated drive button, instead of a drive dial like the X100V, the XE4, and the X Pro 3, then you need to press the drive button and scroll down until you see BKT. Select that, and from there you'll actually see that you can scroll right over and hit focus bracket. And once you select bracket, you'll need to go into the shooting settings menu, again that little camera icon when you hit menu, and you'll look for focus bracket settings. Now it'll be a separate option right in there. Now, unlike the XT series, which has all the bracketing settings together in one folder, the drive button cameras have a separate menu item inside the shooting settings menu. Okay, so no matter which camera you're using, once you get yourself to the focus bracket settings menu, you'll have 3 different parameters to adjust. The first option on this page is called frames, and this is simply how many frames you want the camera to shoot. When you've got the camera all set up in focus bracketing mode and you actually press the shutter and you're ready to shoot, the camera will automatically take a series of photos corresponding to the number of frames you set. And you can set this anywhere from 1 to 999 frames. If you're just starting out, you might try 10 frames and see how that works. I've experimented with up to 50 or 60 frames, and in some cases I've shot 100 frames. With the examples in this video, I've used about 50 frames, and that seems to work pretty well. And it kind of depends on the distance you're trying to capture. If you have an extremely shallow depth of field that you're trying to capture, then you can probably get by with fewer frames. However, if you're shooting a wider subject where you're going to have a lot more increments, then you'll want to bump that number up. You can try doing 999 frames, but remember, you're going to have to load these all into Photoshop as layers, and that could take quite a while, if your computer can even handle it. The second option on this page is called step, and this corresponds to how much the focus distance is going to change between each shot, between each frame. 1 represents the smallest distance between frames, and 10 represents the largest amount of focus distance between the frames. Now the thing is, Fuji hasn't actually provided any documentation anywhere that tells you how far this is between steps. So you'll just have to experiment and see what works for you. In the shots that I've done, I've actually found that 10 works pretty well. However, if you're shooting an extremely close macro scene, then you might want to use a smaller number. The third option on this page is interval, and that simply determines how much time elapses between shots, between when the camera takes the next frame. You can set this anywhere from 0 to 10 seconds. For this kind of work, I don't see why you necessarily need to delay the time between shots by 10 seconds. For most of the focus bracketing that I've done, I've just set it to 0 and had the camera take in a succession of photos immediately one after the other. And the nice thing is that once you set all these parameters to your desired configuration, they'll actually stay that way, even if you turn the camera off. Okay, so once you've got the camera configured, now it's time to actually take your shots. As I mentioned earlier, you're probably going to want to use a tripod. And if you want to shoot macro and close-up, you've got a couple different ways you can do that on the Fuji. You can either use one of the dedicated macro lenses like the 80mm or the 60mm, or you can use one of Fuji's extension tubes like the MCEX11 or 16. I don't have a macro lens, so I use the MCEX11 extension tube, and I find it works really well. These extension tubes will work on any lens, but the rule of thumb is the wider the lens, the closer you'll be able to get to your subject. And while they won't have quite the maximum edge sharpness as you'll find with one of the macro lenses, they still work pretty well and they're much more affordable. And the thing with this kind of photography anyway, when you're shooting extremely close-up macro shots, most of the frame is going to be out of focus anyway, and so that critical sharpness out at the edges is really not going to be that much of a factor. For this red lettuce leaf photo, I used the 35mm f2 with that MCEX11 extension tube. One of my favorite lenses for macro is the 23-1.4. It gets me even closer. I've also gotten good results with a 100 to 400. The nice thing about using longer lenses like that 100 to 400 is you have increased depth of field and a much more comfortable working distance. You also get that classic telephoto compression effect where you kind of bring the background forward. The way to do this technique is to start by focusing on the closest thing that you want to be in focus in your frame. Then when you press the button and start the series, the camera is going to work backwards. You can either have the camera set to manual focus or autofocus. If you're using autofocus, I recommend using single autofocus and then setting the smallest little focus zones for the most accuracy. If you're using manual focus, it really helps to use the focus check feature where you can zoom in and check for critical focus in your scene. And one tip I want to share with you, when I'm shooting macro and extreme close-up, I prefer to keep the camera set to electronic shutter. That minimizes any kind of camera shake between frames. And the last thing you'll want to do before you press the shutter button is to hope and pray there's going to be no wind when you're shooting. Nothing ruins macro photography like the wind. Step number 3. Once you've got all your frames together, it's time to import those into your software and create your final image. The most common way to do this is to select all of your frames and import them into Photoshop all at once. If you don't use Photoshop, there's a few other programs that allow you to do focus stacking, including Affinity Photo. So once you've got all your frames loaded into Photoshop, you want to make it so each frame is a different layer. So follow this menu command to load your files into a stack. If you use Lightroom, you can actually bypass this step. Simply select all of your photos, then go under the Edit menu and choose Open as Layers in Photoshop. And once they're all loaded, you'll have a single multi-layered photo in Photoshop. Now this part is very computer dependent, so if you don't have a very powerful computer, you probably don't want to load very many images. Maybe start with a stack of 10 images. If you have a really powerful computer, there's a good chance it'll be able to handle tens or even hundreds of images. Now once this command finishes running, and it may take a while depending on the speed of your computer, you'll end up with a single multi-layered image. The next step is to go to the Edit menu and choose Auto Align Layers. This step automatically corrects and aligns your layers so that they match perfectly with one another. And it needs to do this because when you're shooting a series and using different focus distances, there's going to be some inherent but very slight differences in how the photos look from frame to frame. And finally, the last step is to go under Edit and hit Auto Blend Layers. And you'll want to make sure the Stack Images box is checked. Then hit OK and wait for it to finish. And it may take a while depending on how fast your computer is, but what comes out the other end is your finished stacked images with all of your layers, all of your different focus layers combined. And chances are it's going to look pretty cool. And at this point you still might need to do a small crop to clean up the image after it auto-align all the layers. But once it's done, you're ready to save or export your final image. Now there will be times where you go through all this process and then the stacked image doesn't look very good. For whatever reason, the computer gets confused and it can't line everything up properly. And there might not be anything you can do to fix this. I guess you could start over and maybe use fewer images and see if that works. Here's another example I did. This was shot with a 100 to 400 using the MCEX11 extension tube. It was made from a series of 60 photos with the step set at 10 and the interval at 0. Here are 3 random images from the series and then the final image so you can see how it all combined. Once you get the hang of it, focus stacking is pretty easy to do and it's a lot of fun. And of course the focus bracketing feature on the Fujis make it even easier to do. It's a technique you probably won't use very often, but it can be a really fun technique to use and it can open up a whole new world of creative photography for you. So I guarantee once you open this little Pandora's box, you'll start looking at the world a little differently. So thanks very much for watching this video. I hope this tutorial helped you understand focus bracketing a little better and how to do it on the Fujis. It's a little confusing at first and you might forget those specific Photoshop steps you need to take in the software, but do it a few times and you'll eventually get the hang of it. And if you are a Fuji user, you'll definitely want to check out my best-selling ebook, X Series Unlimited. It's 400 pages, tells you everything you need to know, how to get the best creative performance and have the most fun with your Fuji. It's widely considered to be the missing manual for the X Series cameras. Please subscribe to my channel and check out some of my other videos. I've got a lot of tutorials up here. You can find me on Patreon and social media at Dan Bailey Photo, and you can visit my blog and website as well. So thanks again for watching, have fun with the cameras out there, and I'll see you next time.